Hey everyone, it's Mr. Levin here with Unit 4, Lesson 1, where we're going to be introducing your first text-based programming language. You're going to be learning Python. So in this lesson, we're going to go through some of the basics of Python, and we're going to compare it to Scratch, because you'll find out that programming languages actually have a lot in common, and so we're going to see a lot of the things that you learned in Scratch and how to do those things in Python. Let's jump into it. Let's begin by looking at some of the differences between Scratch and Python. As you've already gotten familiar with using the Scratch programming environment, we're going to try to make these parallels so that you can take the knowledge that you have in Scratch and then apply it to learning this new programming language, Python. Programming languages have a lot more in common than they do differences, because you can do and write the same algorithms in any programming language. They're going to have the same logic structures. The only difference is that they're going to look slightly different. So the first example of a comparison here is starting and stopping your program. In Scratch, you have the green flag to start and the red stop sign to stop. In your Python environment, you're going to have a little green arrow that indicates the run button, and you click that to run your program. And then you have this stop. So that's starting and stopping your program in Python. If you want to output text, lots of programs that we write, we want to be able to output some information to the screen, have our programs be interactive. In Scratch, we have the say block. In Python, you're going to use the print function. So the print function looks like the word print and then a pair of parentheses, and then you're going to put whatever you want to output to the screen in between quotation marks inside of these parentheses. Basically, you're saying, okay, this area inside the parentheses is the same as this oval inside of your Scratch block. Conditional statements. Conditional statements in Scratch are, these like C blocks, right? Or in this case, because it's the if-else, this is the E block. And we have these openings inside of the block that kind of tell us what kind of information we need to put in there. You have the diamond shape, you have these empty places where you can put code, and we're going to have similar space inside of our if-else statements inside of Python. So in an if-else statement in Python, first you have the word if, and then you would type, and you're not going to type the word condition, you're actually going to write out a true or false condition right here. And we'll look at an example of that in a second. Then you're going to need a colon here to indicate that, okay, this is the beginning of my if condition, and then everything else inside of here is what you do if this condition is true. You'll notice that it's indented over. And then we have the else part of the if-else statement. The else part also uses a colon to say where it starts, and then we indent all of the code that's inside of that else. The indentation is basically like saying this empty area here, it's basically saying this is all a block of code that we're going to run if the condition is true, or if we get into the else part of our if statement. Assigning a value to a variable. This is an important thing to be able to do. And so we're going to have the same functionality that we had in Scratch in Python. In Scratch, you would say set index to, and then the value you want to set it to, like 0. In Python, you're going to say the name of the variable, index, equals 0. So this equal sign is a little different than maybe an equal sign you've seen in a math class, because we're not saying that these two things, we're not like checking if they're equivalent, we're not checking if they're equal. What we're actually doing is we're taking the value here and we're saving it into this variable, much in the same way that you were setting this index variable equal to 0. The next thing you can do here, right, is you can change the value of index by 1. This would be like adding 1 to whatever number was stored in here previously. Well, in Python, you can do this two ways. One is you can say index equals index plus 1, or you can say index plus equals 1. This plus equals operator basically combines equals index plus 1. So both of these ways would accomplish the same thing as this change block. We can also do iteration in Python, right? Repetition, being able to repeat lines of code. So in Scratch, you had the repeat until. Repeat until had this condition. It would keep repeating until, right, this was true. This other type of block we had was repeat 10, so we could repeat a specific number of times. In Python, you have a while loop, and a while loop is actually going to repeat as long as this is true. And then we have the same idea as we had in our if statement, where you have a colon, and then you have indented code that goes in the body. So one key difference to note here is that in Scratch, you have what's called a repeat until block, meaning we repeat until this becomes true. This while loop is different in that it repeats while this statement is true. And so to accomplish the same repetition, you notice I had to switch. Instead of saying x is less than y, I actually said x is greater than or equal to y, because we want it to repeat the same number of times, or repeat as much as this repeat in Scratch. So it's a little tricky to think about, but always try to read it out loud for yourself to understand it. And you say like, okay, repeat while x is greater than or equal to y. The other type of repetition, right, if we want to repeat for a specific number of times, in Python the way you do that is you would say for I is a variable in range, and then this number is going to be how many times you want to repeat. Basically, I is going to take on each of the values in the range here, and it's going to repeat 10 times. All right, next up we have lists. So you may have worked with lists a bit. You've worked with lists in Scratch, but it's important to note that they're slightly different from the lists in Python. This is an important note. In Python, list indexes start at 0, meaning that the first item in a list is item 0. In a list in Scratch, the first item is item 1. This is also the same in AP pseudocode, right, which is the language or the programming language that you're going to have to learn to read on the AP exam. And so we want to just make sure that that's totally clear for you, that in Python your lists start at 0, but in Scratch and pseudocode they start at 1. All right, so let's have a look at some of the syntax. So creating a list, you would just declare it as one of these red variables. In Python, you would give the name of the list and then set it equal to empty, we call these square brackets. All right, so square brackets indicate we're creating a list here. The next thing you might want to do is add something to the list. So here in Scratch, we had add thing to the name of our list. In Python, we would say the name of the list dot append. Append is a fancy word for add something onto the end of a list. So players dot append, and then in quotation marks thing, because this is the word we want to add to our list. We can also find the length of the list. In Python, we do that by saying len, parentheses, and then the list that we want to find the length of. So len is a function here that's going to return the length of that list. And then if we wanted to access the first item on the list, remember, as I mentioned at the beginning, in a Scratch list, you would say item 1 of players. In a Python list, we're going to say players, and then use square brackets here to reference item 0, and that's going to be the first item on the list. Welcome back. We're going to go over a few more important things about Python because we want to make sure you have a strong foundation before you jump into the first coding activity. So first of all, in Python, punctuation matters. Actually, not just in Python. In English, in language, punctuation matters. It changes the meaning of a sentence if you remove a comma. You'll see some examples in the lesson that show how a sentence can become very different or have a very different meaning based on where the commas are placed. In Python, the punctuation mark that you're going to need to be very aware of is the colon, right? These two dots that you would use to make a smiley face. These two dots are important because they mark the start of a code section. This is similar, as I mentioned before, to a gap in an if statement or in a Scratch block. So here you'll see this in an if statement where we say if and then the condition and then we have that colon. This colon is really important because it tells us, okay, that's the end of the condition and that's the beginning of the code that executes if this condition is true. This is the same case with the else statement. This colon indicates, okay, this is the end of the else or the word else, and this marks the beginning of the block of code that we're going to do if our if condition here was false, right? And you're going to see this with all types of control structures, repeats, if else statements. You're going to need to have a colon in the right place in order to indicate where the beginning of a block of code is. So along with that, we also need to know in Python where a block of code ends. So in Python, this is where indentation comes in. Python is a language that was written and designed to be easy to read, but part of that means that we actually are using white space to control the flow of our program. So in Python, indentation groups statements together and it can indicate the end of a chunk of code, a block of your code, right? So in this if statement, these two lines are both going to be executed if this condition is true. And we know that they're both together in this block because they're both indented over, right? If this line was not indented, it was back here at the beginning, then that line would not be part of this if condition and it would execute no matter what. Okay, so indentation also matters in Python. All the different rules we've been learning fall under the umbrella of this term syntax. Syntax is the grammatical rules of a computer programming language. It's like the punctuation of written language. It tells the computer how to structure, how to read some code, and it also helps a person, as we'll see on the next slide. Syntax is helpful for people and computers. When a computer is reading your Python code, it uses that white space, it uses those colons to figure out what you intended and to run your code accordingly. It also helps people because you'll notice that in Python, the spacing makes things much easier to read, right? If this was all just aligned, if you had all this text just in one big paragraph, it would be very difficult to tell, okay, where does this while loop start? Where does this if statement start? Where does this for loop start? Okay, how many times do I actually repeat this? Did I actually have the right number of repetitions? Indentation and really syntax in general is intended to help people be able to read code more easily and also for computers to understand the code and be able to compile it into a program. Case sensitivity. I also wanted to mention that in Python, unlike Scratch, the words and the variable names you use need to be case sensitive. All right, you have to be careful that everything matches exactly. Uppercase letters and lowercase letters are not going to be treated the same. So if you declare one variable called sentence and then try to set it, to another word, say you wanted to, instead of saying hello, you wanted to say goodbye, this here is actually creating a second variable. You're not assigning to the same sentence variable because the S is lowercase in the first example and uppercase in the second variable. These are considered in Python two different variables. All right, the same thing would apply if you were trying to compare two words, like hello with a lowercase h and hello with an uppercase h. If you try to check if they're equal, they're not going to be the same string or the same word because uppercase and lowercase letters are considered different letters. All right, Python is a case-sensitive programming language, and in fact, you'll find that most text-based languages are going to be case-sensitive because everything that's written is part of the code. A string is a data type that is any set of characters that are not considered numbers. And sometimes I use the word string and word interchangeably just because I'm so used to calling them strings that sometimes I just call anything between two quotation marks a string. But in our next lesson, we'll actually go into more detail about the differences between strings and other data types like numbers. Okay, so that is today's lesson, and at this point you should be ready to move on to trying the coding exercise number 1. Coding exercise number 1 is going to ask you to take all the things you just learned about Python syntax and use those skills to debug this program called What Went Wrong. The way that you check if you've debugged the code is you're going to run the code to see if you fixed all the errors. If it runs successfully, then you have fixed the code and you can turn that in. Some common errors that you should look for when you're debugging this program. Misspelled variables, right? Were they trying to spell two variables and spell them incorrectly? Missing colons, missing parentheses around strings, incorrect indentation. Okay, all the things that we talked about in terms of syntax, you're going to want to go back and look at those examples and then use them to debug the program What Went Wrong. Good luck.